Okay, so in the next few minutes, we want to take a look at this step of analysis in terms of doing your criticism. And we've said that the first step of doing criticism, of course, is description. And description is, in essence, that characterization of what you are looking at. That characterization is important and it's valuable, but think of your description as a picture. Okay, it's an image. It is a view of the outside of your artifact. It's what's there. Where is it? Who did it? When was it? How did it get there? That's the sort of stuff that comes up in description. Description is, think of it this way, a picture. It's just a photograph. It's what you can see. It's what's on the surface. It's what's right there. All right. Anybody can get to it. Anybody can see it. Anybody will know exactly what they're looking at when they look at it. Okay. So we look at a picture and we say, oh yeah, okay, well, that's a big rocket that's going to go to the moon. All right. So that's the sort of thing that you are grappling with in description. But description is, of course, only a first step. Analysis is different. All right. Analysis looks at the parts and pieces that make that thing work. So analysis is more like a blueprint. So if we think of description as a photograph of the thing, you should begin thinking of analysis as a blueprint of what's inside that thing. How does this work? What makes it function? Okay, so we've got description. Here's what's there. Analysis is the nuts and bolts. This is how it works. This is what makes it function. And then later, now we're looking ahead, not on the paper you're writing now or the paper that will come due next. We're looking way down the road. Later, in evaluation and interpretation, we'll pick up this idea and we'll talk a little bit more about why those design choices were made. Okay, so the things we find inside our artifact, the blueprint stuff, we're going to later pick that up and we're going to use that to say, okay, later we will reflect on, okay, why were those choices made? And that's what we will use, that question. Why were these design choices made inside my artifact? That is the question that we will use to draw out our judgments, to make reasonable conclusions. And in fact, when your textbook talks about evaluation and interpretation, they mean the reasonable conclusions you're going to draw about this message. The thing that in the lessons on criticism, we said, remember, you're going to make a judgment. This is the judgment. The judgment you're going to make will be a reasonable conclusion, or maybe two or three reasonable conclusions that you're going to draw together. That's your evaluation and your interpretation, and that will come later. Right now, analysis. Analysis is a blueprint. It's a map of how your artifact works. Now, obviously, you can't do it all. It's too complicated. Your artifact is as complicated as a moon rocket, okay? Maybe even a little more complicated in the long run. So you can't do everything in there. So often what we do is we pick some aspect, some point or part of this, and we blow that up and we look at that one, we enlarge it and we look at it in much more depth and detail. So when you begin to think about analysis, you have to recognize you're not going to be analyzing your entire artifact. You're going to find some part of that artifact, some small aspect of that artifact, and you are going to bring that into focus. You're going to blow it up and you're going to talk about how those things work. Now, how do you go about that? Okay, what's the first step in terms of getting into analysis? Okay, the first step in getting into analysis is to go back to your description. Always. Okay, look at the end of your description. Okay, we were just talking about description. Every single artifact is going to have a thesis, we call it. It's just simply that statement where the author, the rhetor, has said, here is what you audience, should move toward. Here's what you should embrace. Here's something you should agree with. That is what your thesis is. It's a statement about what you're supposed to move toward and embrace. Now, the thing about it is, that statement in and of itself is powerful, but obviously your rhetor is not going to just leave that hanging there. Right? They aren't going to just simply leave you with a statement of what you ought to do. They're going to give you reasons why you should do it, right? And those reasons why you should do it, that's your main point. Those are the things that you look. Now, remember, here we're still talking about description. This is the end of your description. End of description, here's where the rhetor wants me to go. And guess what? They tell me, okay, here's a reason you should do that. Here's another reason you should do it. Wow, there's a third reason you ought to do it as well. And the rhetor will lay out a set of main points of reasons why it is a good idea for you to embrace the thesis. That's your basic structure. And that's where your description should end. Okay, so we're not to analysis yet. This is where your description should end. It should end with a statement about where the author wants you to go and a clear outline of the main points about about why you should go there. All right. Now, obviously, this isn't complete either, is it? I mean, the author is clearly, once they've laid out what their main points are, they don't just simply hang those in the air. They clearly have lots and lots of things to say about why that's a really good idea and why you should listen to me and all that sort of stuff. All of that we're going to look at in much more depth and detail. Okay, and as we get a little deeper into analysis, we'll talk about the yada, yada, yada things, right? The things that are going on under those main points. But your description as a whole ends right there. It ends with a statement about what it is this author, this rhetor, wants you to embrace, to move toward, and essentially statements about why that's a good idea. That's the basic structure of description. And it is right there that analysis begins. So if you want to figure out what to do with your analysis, if you want to figure out where to stop, where to start, what your first step is, go to the end of your description and figure out what the thesis is. Look at it long and hard, make sure you got it right, and then pick that thesis up and move forward with this question. What sort of rhetorical devices are present in this message? What are the rhetorical devices that are present here? When we pick up that idea, what are the rhetorical devices that are present here? We're going to say, okay, look, certain devices come into this message and they tell us the following. They tell us how this device, how does the device work? How do the devices interact with each other? That's what analysis is going to show us. What patterns are present in the message? Okay, so these are the things that analysis is going to begin picking up on. It's going to start with that thesis. Here's what the rhetor wants. And it's going to say, okay, what are the rhetorical devices they're using to help get me there? How do those devices work? How do those devices interact with each other? How do they repeat or set themselves in opposition to each other? What patterns am I going to see here as I unpack this message? Okay, how are you going to go through that? You're going to go through it by following 4 steps. So here is a sketch of how to do rhetorical analysis. Now, the analysis step has 4 steps to it. First of all, name that rhetorical device that's present. State the rhetorical device that is there. For example, repetition. We're going to talk about rhetorical devices more here in a second. Repetition is a pretty standard rhetorical advice where somebody says something and they say it a number of times, okay? So name it. Say, hey, I see repetition going on inside this artifact. Okay, once you've named that device, the second thing you do is you're going to go out and you're going to talk about how that device generally works. Now here you're going to have to do a little bit of background. You're going to have to do a little bit of digging. You're going to have to look some things up. What does repetition do? How does it work psychologically? How does it work in terms of moving an audience? Huh? Why do rhetors use repetition? Because they do all over the globe, everywhere, in virtually every culture. Repetition is a strong part of how people build rhetorical artifacts. Why? What is it that makes repetition generally, broadly, work? Once we know what device is present and we know how it generally works, we go into that third step, and that's where you tell us how the device specifically works in your artifact. So we start out by saying, hey, here's repetition. I see repetition in my artifact because I see the following phrase is being repeated. And then I say, well, you know, it's interesting because repetition generally works to do the following things. Repetition increases a sense that this is important. Repetition increases a sense that there is urgency. Repetition can be used to increase memory so that something will be recalled in more depth later. Okay, so that's how repetition generally works. Now here's what's being repeated in my artifact. Oh, look, it's being repeated not immediately one time after another. I tell you, I tell you, I tell you. I'm getting the phrase I tell you 4 different times to start off an idea in my artifact. Okay, wow, I bet that's being used too. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. We have moved from naming a specific device to a discussion about how that kind of a device works, generally speaking. And now we're focused on the presence of that device in my artifact. I call attention to it and I talk about how it's working there. Now, what that does for me is, in the final analysis, I begin to say, okay, here's what doing that does to help my rhetor get their audience over to that thesis. Those are your 4 steps. Name a rhetorical device. Tell how that rhetorical device generally works. Tell us how that rhetorical device is specifically working inside your artifact. 4, tell us how that rhetorical device working that way, functioning that way in your artifact is moving this audience toward that thesis. So we get increasingly specific, focused, and targeted as we move down. Name a device, define it, tell us how it usually works, tell us how it's specifically functioning in your artifact, tell us how that function is moving an audience toward the thesis. Because remember, the goal is to have an audience move toward a thesis. Have an audience say, okay, yeah, you know, that makes sense to me. Okay, yeah, I'm willing to at least entertain that idea. Okay. Your analysis should show us that there are rhetorical devices here, and you're going to name them. You're going to show us how those rhetorical devices generally work. You're going to show us how they're specifically doing some heavy lifting inside your artifact, and you're going to say, and doing that moves the audience toward the thesis. Now, rhetorical devices. I've been throwing that word around a lot, right? And that raises some very obvious questions like, what's a rhetorical device, and where do I find them? Okay, since you're going to clearly be writing your analysis paper by naming rhetorical devices, you might want to try to figure out what rhetorical device is and how do you go out and find them? How do you locate them? That's a really excellent question, but it's a question, believe it or not, we've already answered. Look familiar? When we do criticism, we said, method is a process that guides the reasoning about my artifact, and it gives me data, it gives me information. Now, in the end, theory is going to guide my judgments, those evaluations that I'm going to make later, those reasonable conclusions I'm going to draw. That's going to be guided by theory, but we're not there yet. We'll talk about theory later, guiding our interpretation. Right now, we're looking at method, okay? And we're talking about how method guides the process of reasoning. So in analysis, you're going to find your rhetorical devices by using your method. That's what the method does. The method shows you the rhetorical devices. Now, if you remember when we were looking at this slide in an earlier presentation, we said, hey, look, the result of the method is that you're going to get data, you're going to get information, but that can be a little misleading. Okay, yeah, this is why it's misleading. Method is going to guide your process of thinking about your artifact. That is, method's going to guide your analysis. And the result is that data that you get, the information that comes from applying your method, that information, that data is a list of the rhetorical devices that are present here and how they're working together. That's what your method is going to do for you. So if you apply the method correctly, appropriately to your artifact, that is what will unlock the artifact. And that is what will show you what rhetorical devices are present. Apply your method. That will show you the devices. So what happens is our method will pick us up and will guide us. It will point us toward certain things that are present. You know, we're going to see things that we had not seen before. We're going to notice patterns that had not appeared to us, that we hadn't noticed before. We're going to look and we're going to say, oh, wow, look at that. I didn't realize it, but here, look at that repetition. Oh, there it is again. Same thing right here, over and over again. Now suddenly, I've got a series of things that are happening over and over again. I didn't see that on my own, but I got my method working. And my method taught me how to ask the kinds of questions that highlighted those similarities. And so then I'm in a position where I can begin to say, oh, I see. This is how that's related. That's why this is being repeated. This is happening over and over because the pattern, if you look, the pattern gets more and more frequent, more and more intense toward the end, and that's what's helping to move us toward that thesis, that conclusion that the author wants us to draw. Apply your method, and you will learn about the rhetorical devices that are present in your artifact. That's a method's job. It's a filter. It's a lens that we hold up in front of us in order to better understand the rhetorical processes that are happening inside our artifact. That's the whole point and the whole goal of method. Method is the way to think about your artifact so that you will see the rhetorical devices that are present and how those rhetorical devices are working together. Okay, now we're going to talk more about devices and methods shortly. Okay, but first of all, I want to take a step back and I want to get a glimpse of the bigger picture that we're looking at here. All right, so we know that our method is going to show us the rhetorical devices that are present, and it's going to give us some sense of how they're functioning, how they're working. All right, that's great. But first, let's talk about the way your textbook approaches these things. Your textbook says there are 3 groups of methods. Now, you can group methods in a lot of different ways. So don't feel like this is, the final word on everything. But for our purposes in this class, this is a really good, simple 3-group solution to sort of figuring out and classifying our methods. So they're going to tell you there are 3 methods, and we're going to take a look at each one of them in each one of those groups, right? Each one of those groups of methods in a little bit more depth and detail. The first one they're going to tell you about is the classical method. They're going to talk about later about the dramatistic methods, and then they'll talk about ideological methods. And we'll look at, as I say, we'll look at each of those. What I want you to pay really special attention to right now, however, is the discussion of the classical method. And the reason that's valuable and important is because this is the method you will be using when you write your essay. Everybody in here, no matter which artifact you picked, all of you are going to use the classical method. There's one inside there that you're going to focus on. You're going to use the classical method to write your essay. So the kinds of devices that you're going to find are going to be devices that will be shown to you, be revealed to you, if you will, by the classical method. All right, so let's take a look at the classical method. We're going to look at all 3, but we're going to give a little more attention to the classical methods right now. The focus in the classical method is it starts with the telos, or the purpose, or the ultimate function of a thing. Now, if you pick up that word telos there, that first one, and if you say, wow, I bet that's one of those old Greek words, then bing, you are a winner. That is, in fact, exactly one of those old Greek words. It means the end of something, meaning where it's headed, where it's ultimately headed, where its absolute fulfillment lies, okay? Classical methods are fascinated with the purpose, the function of a thing. Why does this thing exist? Now, that's why, if you think back, I told you a minute ago, hey, focus on that thesis. Start with that thesis in mind, and then we're going to begin asking questions about rhetorical devices. Okay, the thesis is, as far as this artifact is concerned, the telos. It's the telos of this artifact. It's its purpose. It's its function. Why does this rhetorical artifact exist? In order to move the audience toward whatever the thesis is. That's the purpose and the telos, the function of your artifact. That's its job, if you wish. If it does what it's supposed to do, then it's going to move the audience in that direction. All right, now, this idea that there is a purpose or a function, it's not just the purpose or function alone. There's a reason we want to focus on the purpose and the function, because if you know a thing's purpose, if you know the absolute function of a thing, then you are quite capable of deducing criteria, a checklist of things that will guide your judgment. Think about it here. If you know the purpose of something, you can put together a list of criteria that will allow you to make reasonable judgments. In other words, that's how you do criticism. Remember, criticism is a process of making reasoned judgments. Oh, look, if you know the telos of something, you can deduce criteria that allow you to make reasonable judgments. That is to say, you can do criticism. Now, let's take an example, something really practical. So, which is a better vehicle? So you tell me, what's the better car here, or the better vehicle here? Dodge Ram, Toyota Prius? Well, which is a better vehicle? Well, now that's going to depend, isn't it? In other words, if you're thinking in the back of your mind, well, doesn't that depend on what I want to do with it? Oh, yeah, that's exactly right. Because if we set these two up and we ask you, hey, here are two vehicles, which one of these would be a better vehicle for you? Then basically we're in a situation where, now I can build the whole system up just like that. So if I'm saying, hey, I need a commute car, well, that's a whole different set of criteria than if I come along and I say, you know what, I'm really into off-roading and I work construction. So if you plan on using your vehicle for off-roading and to haul things in construction, then I assure you a Toyota Prius is not the vehicle you want, right? On the other hand, for crying out loud, if you're commuting 70 miles a day one way to work, you don't want a Dodge Ram. You want a Toyota Prius. That's the better vehicle. And it's the better vehicle because it fits your telos, purpose, function, what you need this vehicle to do. Tell me what you want it to do. Tell me what you need it for. And once we know what you need it for, we can set up the criteria in order to make a good judgment. So if you tell me, I commute, I got 70 miles one way, and I got to go 4 times a week at least, then we're ready to say, okay, so when you're looking for a vehicle, the criteria you need great gas mileage. You need something that's reliable because you don't want to break down halfway to work. You need something that's going to have some comfort in it, because if you're driving 70 miles one way to work, you better be comfortable. And you need some hands-free options. You're going to be on the road an hour and a half, 2 hours. For crying out loud, you better be able to tell the car, hey, call my wife or call my girlfriend, and get somebody on the phone and chat with them when you get a little sleepy there on the commute, right? So these are all great things to have in a commuter car, because the telos, the function, the purpose of my vehicle is long distance commuting. Those criteria make a lot of sense. That same set of criteria would make no sense whatsoever if I work construction and I do off-roading. Okay, now I've got a whole different set of criteria. So you come to me and I say, hey, I'm in the mood for a vehicle. And you say, well, what are you going to use it for? And you say, man, I got a landscaping business of my own, and I got to haul some construction material to build fences and retaining walls, and and on the weekends I do off-roading, and I need one vehicle that's going to cover it both. Okay, now we're in a position where, now that we know that telos, that function, that purpose, now we can figure out, okay, so what criteria is going to build for us a vehicle choice that is going to fulfill that function? Well, first of all, I need payload. I need to be able to haul stuff, okay? Reliability, oh, that looks familiar. Yeah, I mean, nobody wants a car that breaks down a lot, right? I got to work on something that's got some power, okay? I got to pull stumps out occasionally. I got to, every so often, I'm going to be hauling a trailer behind me. I need some torque, okay? I need engine size and I need torque. And obviously, if I'm doing the off-roading and I'm doing all the landscaping and construction, and I need something I can clean fairly easily. I don't need a car that I am in no need of a vehicle that requires 3.5 hours to get the inside clean. I need to be able to hose the thing out and keep moving, right? Okay, now I've got a different set of criteria that allow me to make a judgment about whether or not this is a good car. So when I start out to say, this is a good message, the first thing I have to do is know what the telos of that message is. What's the function? What's the purpose of the message? And then I say, okay, now, if that was its purpose, if the purpose of this message was to convince me to buy a pet giraffe, here are the criteria for the kind of thing that would make me say yes to buying a pet giraffe. These are the criteria I can use to decide whether or not this functioned well, accomplished its purpose, fulfilled its telos. All that means the same thing. I can raise that question. What are the criteria that would be necessary for this message to succeed with this audience in this location at this time? See how very particular that is? Rhetoric is very specific. What criteria would make this goal, this message, this telos, this thesis, what criteria would make this thesis work on this audience at this time in this place? That's how I'm going to make my judgment. I'm going to make my judgment by starting by saying, okay, what's the telos here? What's the function? Now, this is classical models, right? The classical model, I start with the telos. What is the purpose? What is the function of this vehicle? Vehicle in our case is the message, the artifact you're working with. What's its purpose? What's it trying to do? The next step we make is we say, okay, what would it need to accomplish in order to fulfill that purpose? Given its goal, given the specific audience it's addressing here, given the setting, the time and place, what would that message have to do in order to move its audience a little bit toward the thesis? That's your criteria. That's how you're going to decide whether or not this is a good message, a successful message. Now, do you see how we are still at a place where you don't get to say, I like it, I don't like it, I agree, I disagree? Not even in analysis. Not even in analysis, when we're drawing up our criteria, do we get to say, well, this is a stupid message and it'll never work. No, you don't get to do that. You have to say, given this goal, this thesis, this telos for this message, given this goal in front of that audience, what would that message have to do? And then you ask yourself, did it do it? Okay, when we get to did it do it, that's when we're going to evaluation. That's when we're going to make our judgment call. The method shows us whether or not the message fulfilled the criteria, because the message shows us what rhetorical devices are there, and it shows us what those devices generally do, and it shows us what those devices specifically do here. And it shows us then, we begin to determine, okay, and how was that supposed to move the audience toward that thesis? And that's where we begin to slip ever so slightly into evaluation and interpretation, making our judgments about the message. But even in analysis, we're looking at drawing up criteria, examining how they work, and seeing those devices that are present. But the heart, the core, the center of classical methodology is to establish the criteria by understanding the telos, and then asking whether or not the message managed to do that well. Okay, so those are the three parts of that classical ideal. What's the function? From the function, we are able to derive the criteria. From the criteria, we are able to derive judgments about whether or not the message was valuable. All right, that's the classical method. Now, we said there were three, and I said we're going to spend a little bit more time on that first one. So that's the first one, the classical, and that's the one that we're going to be looking at and picking apart in a little bit more depth and detail. Right now, we're going to go to the second. So we said there are three groups of methods out there. The first group is classical method. The second group is the dramatistic methods. Dramatism differs from the classical method. It works in a different way. In dramatism, and it sounds so complicated before you actually get in and try to work with it a little bit, which we're going to do a little later. But the dramatistic group of methods, and there are a number of them, they're focused not on telos. That's not what they are centered on and hung up about. Okay, they're not focused on the telos. That's not what they ask. They ask this. They say, okay, how are the parts of the message related? And by parts of the message, they're not thinking of the thesis, the main point, subpoints. That's not what they're doing. They're not thinking thesis, main point one, main point two, main point three. When they say parts of the message, here's how the dramatistic view works. The dramatistic view says messages function like stories. They function like a good movie. You know, there's a beginning, there's a middle, there's an end. There should be a little sense of drama that something's important, and there should be some sense that it's finished, it's wrapped up, the resolution made this work for me. Okay, so actually the way messages work is they work by creating a sense of story that we respond to. Now, it's not that they tell stories. I mean, they do sometimes. They tell stories. You know, they use narratives as you know, to make a point or something. But this dramatistic school of methods, these methods say all messages, like messages in a scientific journal, all right, scholarly articles in a scientific journal, they're still organized around the idea of drama, of a story, of tensions that are out there that need to be resolved. And it's a story of characters struggling to make the right thing happen, and other characters interfering with this process of making the good result appear. And all rhetoric is somehow framed in a way that there are characters, and there's a plot, and there are antagonists, and there's a building sense of tension and action that helps resolve things, and it's all situated in some kind of a setting, a context, you know, stagecraft. So all of these are elements. And when dramatism thinks about, hey, how are the parts of a message related to each other in order to move the audience, those are the questions dramatists are interested in. So if we do a dramatistic analysis, and you'll have a chance to do one of those later, if we do a dramatistic analysis, then what you do is you pick up this theme and you begin to say, okay, what is it in this message that is acting and sounding like a character, like the good guy and the bad guy? What is it in here that's sounding like a heroine who is standing forward to make her proclamation about what has to happen before, before the world can be made right again? What's going on here in this story of this artifact? And so we focus on the who, what, when, where, why, how inside the story of the message. And we focus on making sense out of how those are related. Now, in a situation like that, we said in classical analysis, basically you derive criteria and you say, did the message fulfill these criteria? That's the simplest understanding of it. Well, here in dramatistic analysis, the simplest understanding of the judgment that you're going to make at the end, it's not based on that kind of a flow. It's based on whether or not the story is a good story. Okay, is there consistency? Do the characters behave well? Right? Do they fulfill their role as the villain and the hero? Is the tension real or is it made up? But we look at when we do dramatistic criticism, when we do dramatistic analysis, we're doing that to set up a judgment that is based on whether or not the story is consistent. Now, consistency in dramatism is not any kind of dull predictability. Okay, that's not. That is emphatically not what this is about. It's about whether or not we've framed the story in a way that that artifact can resonate with my experiences of life. And has it done it without cheating, on the characters or on the plot in some way? I mean, that's one of the marks of a horrible movie. A really terrible film is one where some character in the film seems like a perfectly good person. They're absolutely flawless throughout the entire movie. And then in the last scene, you discover actually they're this deep, dark villain, but there was no clue that they were a deep, dark villain before you get to the last scene. Okay. Well, that's when you get to, when you watch a movie like that, it's like, yeah, come on. That's where you go in a movie like that. So you get to the end of a film like that, and it's like, I got cheated. Okay. Good artifacts, rhetorical artifacts, don't cheat that way. They build a really nice, clear, clean story with believable characters. Now, what all of that means in terms of how an artifact is put together, we'll look at it in more depth and detail when we get into dramatistic schools of analysis, which is going to come up as soon as we're done with the classical school. We said there were 3 schools, and we mentioned the classical school. We mentioned the dramatistic school. There is a 3rd school, and that school is called the ideological school. And the ideological school of criticism has a different focus again. It does not focus on the telos, the purpose of a message, and derive from that criteria for judging the message. Nor does it focus on any kind of interior structure or sense of development and drama that might be present in the message, and critique whether or not that flows in a way that makes sense in the real world. Ideological criticism has different concerns. Ideological criticism is focused. It's the place it's zeroed in on are questions of inclusion and exclusion. The focus here is on my preferred in-group. Okay, the tribe, if you will, of my sort. And so we start with this sense that there are these groups of people who in some form, they have an identity. That's part of where this ideological idea comes from. They have a certain identity or form of identity or expression of identity or association with identity because they have others who fit that identity, and they are drawn into this group. And then in ideological criticism, we basically make judgments. We raise questions and make judgments about issues of marginalization and inclusion, exclusion and inclusion, and how social power is used. Now, the tall and the short of it is ideological criticism is honeycombed. There are thousands of methods, almost certainly thousands of methods out there that function under this very, very broad headline almost of critical methods. So ideological criticism is really huge, and it's really complex, and it's really hard to rein in any, which is fitting, because the goal of ideological criticism is very frequently to decenter these assumptions that go into organizing and ordering things with certain definitions of power in our social interactions. So it's fitting that they're a little hard to pin down. That's perfectly consistent. A dramatistic critic would say, ideological critics are, they do a good job with that, because they start by saying you can't pin us down, and indeed it's hard to pin them down. So it's a honeycomb of different identity statements and different senses of how power is loose in the world, and what corrals it and what doesn't corral it, right? how it gets to just simply run free sometimes without the sort of checks and balances that make life and civilization pleasant, right? Because nobody likes to live under utterly unfettered power in somebody else's hands. So it's that question of power. It's the question of inclusion and exclusion about specific group identities that sort of is the hallmark of ideological criticism. We'll take a look at that one as well, though we won't get to that until a little later in the semester. So your first essay in here, the one you're working on right now, is going to employ the classical method. Okay? That's what you're focused on, and that's what we are going to take up, and we're going to look at that method in terms of its nuts and bolts more in more detail in our next lesson. But that's where we'll work from. We're going to start with that idea of doing classical criticism, and the classical method is going to be what's going to guide us through that part of your next adventure in the class. We'll pick that up in our next lesson.